my presence would disappear beneath the shadow of my father's retirement party, but humiliation never stays quiet. My dad blocked the entrance to my brother's villa and laughed, asserting I would never possess the money or status to step inside, while my mom urged me not to embarrass the family. What they didn't know was that the realtor had already arrived, and one calm sentence was about to expose exactly who had been judging me. I wore a simple navy dress that evening. It cost more than anything in my mother's closet, though she would never know that. The air carried expensive catering scents, and soft landscape lighting transformed my brother's new villa into something worthy of an architectural magazine. Guests milled about the manicured lawn in clusters. Their laughter floated toward a darkening sky, dotted with the first evening stars. I had driven myself here in a car that looked ordinary from the outside. This was a deliberate choice made years ago when I realized invisibility was sometimes the greatest power a woman could possess. No one approached me when I stepped through the wrought iron gate. That was not unusual. I stood at the edge of the crowd for several minutes, watching relatives and family friends exchange pleasantries, clink crystal glasses, and gesture toward the villa's impressive facade, as if they themselves had laid each stone. My brother Richard stood near the grand entrance, accepting congratulations for a home purchased with money our father had quietly allocated to him over the years, through complex business structures and opaque private arrangements that were perfectly legal, yet carefully shielded from scrutiny. My mother orbited him like a devoted satellite, adjusting his collar, refilling his wineglass, and ensuring every guest understood the magnitude of his accomplishment. Not once did either of them glance in my direction. I moved through the party like a ghost wearing designer fabric, nodding politely when someone accidentally made eye contact, but never being drawn into genuine conversation. The exclusion was so complete and so practiced that it had become a kind of performance art perfected over 3 decades of family gatherings. I had learned long ago not to expect acknowledgement from these people who shared my blood, but never my confidence. What surprised me was how little their rejection hurt anymore. The wound had scarred over somewhere around my 30th birthday, leaving behind something harder and infinitely more useful than pain clarity. I watched my father work the room with the confidence of a man who believed his version of reality was the only one that existed. He shook hands with the firm grip he had practiced since his 20s. He told embellished stories about his career in banking and accepted praise for raising such a successful son. At no point during these performances did he mention that he had 2 children. I had become so thoroughly erased from the family narrative that some of these guests probably did not even know I existed. The villa itself was impressive, I had to admit. It featured Mediterranean-style architecture designed to impress from a distance the kind people admire before they ever step inside its floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing glimpses of designer furniture. A swimming pool in the back glittered like liquid sapphire under string lights. Richard had done well for himself, or rather our father's money had done well for Richard. The property was worth perhaps $2 million a sum that would have seemed astronomical to me once before I understood what real wealth looked like. When I finally approached the front entrance, I was not looking for confrontation. I simply wanted to see the interior everyone had been praising all evening. The double mahogany doors stood open, golden light spilling onto the stone pathway like a welcome mat for everyone except me. I was 3 steps away when my father materialized in the doorway, his body positioned squarely in the center. He blocked access with the deliberate precision of a man accustomed to controlling who belonged where. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he stood there with hands clasped behind his back, allowing the moment to stretch until several nearby guests noticed and turned to watch. The silence was calculated, designed to draw attention to what was about to happen. My father had always understood the theatrical power of an audience. He knew humiliation delivered privately was merely an insult, but humiliation delivered publicly was a lesson that scarred. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the easy tone of someone sharing an amusing observation at a cocktail party. "Eleanor," he said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "you know you'll never have the money or status to own something like this. Why torture yourself by looking at what you can't have? A few people laughed that polite, uncomfortable laughter of those who recognized cruelty but were too invested in the social hierarchy to challenge it. Others simply watched with carefully neutral expressions, waiting to see how I would respond. I could have said something. I could have told him exactly how wrong he was and how spectacularly he had misjudged the daughter he had spent decades ignoring. But I had learned through years of bitter experience that some battles are won by refusing to fight them in the moment. I stood absolutely still, holding his gaze without flinching, letting the silence speak for itself. The quiet seemed to unsettle him more than any clever retort would have. He had expected me to shrink to apologize or to retreat with my head bowed in appropriate shame. When I did none of those things, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his weathered face before he masked it with another dismissive laugh. My mother materialized at his side like she had been summoned by some invisible alarm system calibrated to detect potential embarrassment. She placed a manicured hand on his arm and looked at me with the expression she reserved for social emergencies, a toxic mixture of disappointment and warning I had seen countless times throughout my childhood. "Eleanor," she said quietly, though not quietly enough to prevent the nearest guests from hearing, "please don't embarrass the family. This is your father's special night. Try to remember, this isn't about you." She did not ask why I was being blocked from entering my own brother's home. She did not question whether her husband's behavior was appropriate or kind. She simply assumed, as she always had, that I was the problem requiring management. My brother appeared behind them. His face wore the carefully neutral expression of someone who had learned that silence was safer than solidarity. He did not defend me. He did not suggest that perhaps our father was being unreasonable or cruel. He simply stood there in his expensive suit, a passive witness to the familiar ritual of my exclusion, his silence an endorsement of everything happening in front of him. The guests who had gathered to watch seemed to accept this dynamic as normal as expected, as simply the way this family operated. I made a decision in that suspended moment. I would not leave, but I would not fight. I stepped gracefully to the side, moving away from the entrance, but remaining visible, present, and unmoved by their collective judgment. My father seemed satisfied with this partial victory. He turned back to his adoring guests, resuming his performance as the patriarch of a successful family. My mother followed, launching into conversation, designed to smooth over any lingering awkwardness. My brother disappeared into the villa without looking back. The party continued around me as if I did not exist, as if I were merely part of the landscaping. Music played from hidden speakers. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of champagne and elaborate canapes. Guests admired the architecture and congratulated my father on his retirement. I stood at the periphery of it all, watching and waiting, though I could not have explained precisely what I was waiting for. Then I heard it, a fragment of conversation from a staff member near the catering tent, speaking quietly into her phone. "The Realtor confirmed she'll arrive within the hour." The words meant nothing to most people at this celebration, but they landed in my ears like a promise. The Realtor, I knew exactly who that was, and I understood with sudden clarity why she was coming tonight. I looked at the villa, at my father's self-satisfied smile, and at my mother's careful management of every social interaction. They believed they had won something tonight. They believed they had successfully reminded me of my place in their carefully constructed hierarchy. I did not leave because I was defeated. I stayed because this was exactly where I needed to be when the truth finally stepped into the light. The party swirled around me in a blur of champagne bubbles and polite laughter, but I was somewhere else, entirely trapped in the amber of memory. I watched patterns repeat themselves with the mechanical precision of a play performed 1,000 times. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s approached my father, gesturing casually toward me with his crystal champagne flute. "Is she family?" he asked, nothing more than casual curiosity, small talk from someone filling conversational space. My father's response came without hesitation, smooth as aged whiskey over broken glass. "Just a relative," he said. The vagueness was intentional. The dismissal was complete in its economy. He did not say daughter. He did not speak my name. I heard every syllable from 15 feet away, and I understood with perfect clarity that this was not carelessness or forgetfulness. This strategy was refined over decades. Standing there in the shadows of my father's retirement celebration, watching him expertly redirect conversations away from my existence, I found myself pulled backward through time to another party. Another evening when I had been physically present, but systematically erased from the family portrait. I was 23 years old, fresh out of business school, with honors attending a celebration for my brother Richard's first significant promotion at the investment firm where my father had arranged his position. The living room of my parents' sprawling suburban house had been transformed into a showcase for family friends, business associates, and carefully selected neighbors who would appreciate witnessing the Ashford family's continued success. The air smelled of expensive catering and my mother's signature perfume. Everywhere I looked, people were raising glasses to my brother's golden future. My father had spent nearly 30 minutes that evening introducing Richard to important contacts, listing his grades, his internships, and his natural talent for finance. When someone in the crowd finally noticed me standing awkwardly near the fireplace and asked what I did, my mother stepped in before I could form the first word. "Eleanor is still figuring things out," she said with that particular tight smile she reserved for managing disappointments. "Not everyone finds their path as quickly as Richard. Some children need more time to mature." The assembled group nodded with theatrical sympathy. The conversation flowed onward like a river diverting around an inconvenient stone, while I stood there with unspoken words dying in my throat. I tried afterward to explain to my mother that I had already started my own consulting business, that I had paying clients, growing revenue, and a reputation beginning to spread through word of mouth. She waved away my words like cigarette smoke. "You made everyone uncomfortable," she said. "That evening was about Richard. Why do you always insist on making everything about yourself?" The memory dissolved and reformed into another shape, another wound. My brother, at 28, made a catastrophic investment decision that cost him nearly everything he had saved from his impressive salary. He had followed a tip from a friend of a friend and ignored every principle of due diligence, losing close to $300,000 in a matter of weeks. My father discovered the disaster during a routine conversation about family finances and responded with swift, silent efficiency. Money transferred through a series of sophisticated private accounts utilizing complex financial maneuvers intended to maintain the utmost discretion. Richard's credit was repaired. The incident was buried so deeply that even my mother may not have known the full extent. That same year, emboldened by my growing client list and confident in my expanding business model, I asked my parents for a modest loan to fund my company's expansion, a fraction of what they had quietly given Richard to cover his gambling on a bad investment. My father laughed in my face. "You want me to throw good money after bad?" His voice carried the amused condescension he reserved for what he considered foolish requests. "Come back when you have something actually worth investing in, Eleanor. Preferably with a business plan written by someone who understands business." He delivered this verdict at a family dinner with Richard and his new girlfriend as witnesses. No one at the table objected. No one pointed out the staggering double standard. There was another memory sharper than the others, carrying edges that still cut a family meeting about my grandmother's estate, held the year after she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The discussion centered on how to handle her considerable investments. I suggested an alternative approach to the proposed distribution, one that would have saved the family significant money in taxes while still honoring our grandmother's wishes. My father dismissed the idea before I finished explaining it. "That's not how these things work, Eleanor," he said, with the particular weariness he used when forced to explain obvious realities to those too simple to grasp them. "Leave the financial decisions to people who understand finance." Everyone nodded and moved on to other matters. 6 months later, when my exact approach had been independently suggested by the estate attorney and implemented with considerable savings, no one mentioned that I had proposed it first. The credit simply evaporated into thin air, absorbed by the family's collective assumption that good ideas could not possibly originate from the daughter who had never quite measured up. Back in the present moment, my father was clapping Richard enthusiastically on the shoulder, performing the role of proud patriarch for an audience that had no concept of how carefully that pride was rationed, or how precisely it was directed. My mother circulated among the guests with the efficiency of a seasoned hostess, ensuring every conversation eventually curved back toward Richard's success, his beautiful villa, and his promising future. The system functioned with well-oiled perfection, each family member understanding their assigned role. An older woman approached me, someone I vaguely recognized from previous family gatherings, perhaps a distant aunt or long-standing family friend. "Your father talks about your brother constantly," she offered pleasantly, as if this observation were a gift I should gratefully receive. "He must be so terribly proud. Richard has accomplished so much." She did not seem to notice the implication of her words, the assumption embedded within them that there was nothing about me worth discussing and no accomplishment worth mentioning. In years past, I would have tried to correct this distorted impression. I would have mentioned my work, my growing investment portfolio, and the life I had constructed without their support or even their knowledge. But experience had taught me that defending myself to people who had already accepted the family narrative was an exhausting waste of precious energy. So I simply nodded and offered a response so neutral it bordered on silence. I watched her grow slightly uncomfortable with my refusal to perform the expected role of gracious failure. The realization had assembled itself slowly over the years, built from 1,000 small moments of erasure and diminishment. My family did not simply overlook me through carelessness or busy neglect. They actively needed me to remain small. Richard's success required a contrast, a shadow against which his light could shine more brilliantly. My parents' cherished narrative of raising a brilliant, accomplished son required a counterpoint, a cautionary tale of the child who had not quite measured up despite every advantage. I was not failing to meet their expectations. I was fulfilling them perfectly by remaining in the diminished role they had assigned me before I was old enough to understand that roles could be refused. A new decision crystallized within me, harder and more luminous than any I had made before. I would not attempt to correct their narrative anymore. I would not exhaust myself trying to prove my worth to people who had constructed their identities around my perceived inadequacy. I would simply wait. And when the truth became impossible to ignore, I would not need to say a single word in my own defense. A woman in her late 50s approached me dripping with the kind of tasteful jewelry that whispers wealth rather than shouting it. She carried herself with the particular confidence that develops over decades of country club membership and charity board positions. I recognized the expression on her carefully maintained face. Polite curiosity seasoned with the automatic assumption that I was somehow out of place in this gathering. "So," she said, tilting her head at an angle that suggested she was being generous by acknowledging my existence, "are you visiting from out of town?" The question revealed everything about what she had already been told. She did not ask if I lived nearby. She did not inquire how I knew the family or what brought me to the celebration. She assumed I did not belong here, that my presence required justification, and that I was a visitor rather than a daughter. I understood immediately what had happened. My father had been telling stories. The narrative had been distributed before I ever stepped through the gate. I had been introduced to these strangers before I opened my mouth, and the introduction had been designed to ensure they looked at me and saw exactly what my family wanted them to see. Before I could formulate a response, I heard my father's voice carrying from a nearby cluster of guests. He was employing his confidential tone, pitched just loudly enough to be overheard by anyone within 15 feet, designed to spread information efficiently while maintaining the performance of discretion. "Eleanor has always preferred a simpler life," he was explaining to his attentive audience. "Not everyone has the drive for real success, and honestly, that's perfectly fine. She seems happier living within her limitations." The words slithered through the evening air like oil spreading across still water, smooth and nearly impossible to grasp hold of for examination. Nothing he said was technically demonstrably false. I did prefer simplicity in certain aspects of my carefully curated life. I was genuinely happy in ways he could never understand. But the context he constructed, the implications he wove, and the careful selection of facts painted a portrait of contented mediocrity. That was a masterwork of manipulation, perfected over 3 decades of practice. My mother materialized near the same group, adding her own practiced brushstrokes to the family portrait. "She's just not like Richard," she said with a sigh that communicated maternal disappointment nobly and graciously borne. "Some children simply don't need as much to feel content. We've accepted that about Eleanor." A well-dressed woman in the cluster nodded with sympathy. I watched the narrative take hold, like roots spreading through fertile soil. Strangers accepting a carefully constructed version of me, assembled without my knowledge or consent. The timing was choreographed with precision that spoke of long practice. Just as my parents completed their character work, my brother emerged from his villa's grand entrance, and the collective spotlight swung toward him with the inevitability of gravity. He was introduced to the same group with an entirely different vocabulary. Ambitious, driven, and naturally talented, the pride and culmination of everything our family valued. His villa became the conversation's gravitational center, a physical manifestation of success and proof that the Ashford family had produced at least one child worthy of admiration. No one asked what I did for work. No one inquired about my life, my accomplishments, or my journey. The story had already been comprehensively told. In my family's distributed version of reality, there was nothing interesting to ask. A man I did not recognize approached me with the comfortable smile of someone making obligatory small talk at a social function. "You must be the low-pressure one in the family," he offered, clearly intending the observation as a kindness. He was attempting to acknowledge what he believed to be my humble position in the family hierarchy without making the moment awkward. But the words landed on my ears like a judge's verdict, a rubber stamp of official approval on everything my parents had carefully disseminated. I felt the familiar impulse rise within me, the almost irresistible urge to correct the record, to explain the truth of my life, and to present evidence that contradicted the fiction being circulated among these well-dressed strangers. But hard experience had taught me where that path led. Correction inevitably meant conflict, and conflict meant I became the problem, the difficult one, the daughter who made every family gathering uncomfortable with her defensiveness. My parents had constructed an elegant system where any attempt to defend my own dignity automatically reinforced their narrative about my character. I decided to try anyway, just once, with the smallest possible intervention. "Actually," I said to a nearby guest, "I work in real estate investment." It was the tiniest fraction of the truth, a single sentence, containing none of the details that would have fundamentally reframed everything they thought they knew. My father appeared at my elbow instantly, as if summoned by some invisible alarm, calibrated to detect any deviation from the approved family script. "Eleanor dabbles in a few things here and there," he said, with a dismissive wave that reduced my entire career to a hobby unworthy of serious consideration. "But let me tell you about Richard's expansion plans for the property he's thinking of adding a guest house." The conversation pivoted away from me with such practiced smoothness that it felt professionally choreographed. Within seconds, I was once again invisible, a background element in a painting focused on other subjects. I noticed something important then, something I had not fully grasped in all my years of family gatherings. The story my parents told about me was not improvised or adapted to circumstances. It was meticulously rehearsed. The phrases came too smoothly, and the conversational pivots were executed with too much precision. This was a narrative they had been polishing for decades, refining it with each repetition at each social event until it flowed with the naturalness of absolute truth. They knew exactly what to say and when to say it, because they had told these same stories so many times before that it had become their reality. I implemented a strategic shift. Instead of continuing to correct the false narrative, I stopped engaging with it entirely. When someone repeated something my parents had said about my limited ambitions, I responded with neutral acknowledgement and offered nothing more. When someone commented sympathetically on my simple life, I simply nodded without elaboration or defense. The reactions were genuinely interesting. People grew visibly uncomfortable when I refused to perform my expected role to either confirm their assumptions or deny them with the defensiveness that would prove their assumptions correct. Several conversations terminated abruptly, the other parties uncertain how to continue when I would not participate in my own diminishment. My family interpreted my new silence as their complete victory. I observed it in my father's increasingly satisfied glances across the lawn, in the tension releasing from my mother's carefully maintained shoulders, and in my brother's casual assumption that all was proceeding according to the natural order. They believed they had successfully managed the potential embarrassment of having their less successful child present at their triumphant gathering. They had distributed their carefully crafted version of Eleanor to every guest who mattered, and no one had raised an objection. What they fundamentally failed to understand was that I was no longer expending energy fighting their narrative. I was simply waiting with patience developed over 30 years for someone outside their control to rewrite everything they thought they knew. I caught a fragment of conversation drifting from the catering station. A staff member was confirming logistics on her phone. "The Realtor is approximately 15 minutes out." The words floated past every other ear without registering significance, but they landed in my awareness like a key turning in a long, locked door. They had spent the entire evening defining who I was for everyone present. They were about to discover that their monopoly on that definition had an expiration date. My phone vibrated softly in my clutch, a subtle electronic pulse that suddenly seemed louder than all the conversation and music swirling around me. I knew before looking at the screen that it would be from Marina, my business partner of 7 years, the woman who handled the operational complexities of everything I had constructed, while my family remained blissfully unaware of my existence as anything other than a disappointment. Her message was characteristically concise, urgent, and professionally direct. "Need confirmation on the Harrington deal tonight. They're proceeding with or without our final terms by midnight." The Harrington deal, 8 figures over 3 years, 18 months of careful negotiation. It was the kind of complex real estate portfolio transaction that would permanently cement our position as the region's premier private investment firm for ultra-high net worth individuals. I had been cultivating the Harrington family's trust for nearly 4 years, patiently building the relationship, demonstrating expertise without desperation, and positioning myself as the inevitable choice when they finally decided to restructure their considerable property holdings. And now, this culmination required my focused attention at the precise moment I was standing at my father's retirement party, being publicly dismissed as the family disappointment and playing a role I had not auditioned for and did not want. I stared at the glowing screen, then lifted my gaze to survey the party unfolding around me. The calculation I faced was brutal in its stark clarity. If I excused myself now to handle this business requiring immediate attention, my family would have their narrative validated and amplified. Eleanor couldn't even stay for her own father's retirement celebration. Eleanor always prioritizes herself over family. Eleanor has never understood what loyalty and love actually mean. The whispered criticisms would follow me to every family gathering for the next decade. But if I remained here allowing this deal to slip away while I worried about the opinions of people who had never valued anything I accomplished, I would be sacrificing something I had built with my own intelligence and persistence for people who had demonstrated repeatedly that my achievements meant nothing to them. I chose to stay not for my family's sake or to earn approval that would never genuinely come, but because the timing was not yet right for what I sensed was approaching. The Realtor Victoria was coming. Something significant was preparing to shift in this carefully controlled environment. Every instinct I had developed over years of successful business dealings told me I needed to be physically present when the shift occurred. My father's sharp eyes noticed me examining my phone from across the manicured lawn. He could never resist an opportunity to perform for an audience, especially when that performance reinforced the evening's dominant theme. "Work problems," he called out with deliberate volume, ensuring nearby guests would hear and turn to observe. His tone carried unmistakable amusement, as if the very concept of me having work important enough to demand urgent attention was inherently laughable. Several people rotated to watch this small drama, their faces holding the mild interest of audience members at a play they had not expected to find entertaining. I slid my phone back into my clutch without sending a response to Marina's urgent message. "I'll handle it later," I said. keeping my voice carefully neutral and refusing to provide the defensive reaction he was clearly hoping to provoke and display. My father nodded with visible satisfaction, turning to the guests clustered around him. "You see," he said, gesturing toward me with his champagne glass. "No pressure with our Eleanor. She figured out long ago how to keep her life simple and small." There's something almost admirable about that kind of acceptance. The words were a precision instrument of humiliation, soft enough in tone to seem almost complimentary, yet sharp enough in implication to draw blood from anyone who understood what he was really saying. Another vibration. Another message from Marina. "Harrington getting cold feet. We cannot wait much longer without losing leverage." I studied the screen and felt the considerable weight of the decision pressing against my chest like a physical force. This was what my family had never understood, could never understand, because they had never bothered to look beyond their assumptions about who I was. Every moment of strategic silence came at a real and measurable cost. Every time I chose not to correct their distorted narrative, not to defend my substantial accomplishments, or not to demonstrate my actual worth, I was making a sacrifice that required something valuable from me. Tonight, I was betting everything on a realtor running late and my own intuition about what her arrival would mean. My mother appeared at my elbow with the silent approach she had perfected over decades of family management. She leaned close enough that I could smell her signature perfume, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You should probably leave soon, Eleanor, before you say something that makes this evening awkward for everyone." She was not asking about my well-being or curious about the messages that had obviously captured my attention. She was managing me with the same efficiency she applied to the catering schedule and seating arrangements, identifying a potential source of embarrassment and moving to neutralize it before damage occurred. I did not respond with words. I simply turned to meet her gaze, directly holding her eyes with mine, until she grew visibly uncomfortable and turned away to attend to other matters. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt enormously significant in the moment. For the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I was not automatically playing my assigned role in the family performance. I was not apologizing for my existence, explaining my choices, or demonstrating appropriate daughterly deference to her superior judgment. I was simply existing as myself, present and unmoved by her expectations. And that fundamental change in my behavior seemed to disturb her more deeply than any verbal argument could have. Across the illuminated lawn, my brother was holding court near the villa's impressive entrance, entertaining a rotating audience of admirers with detailed stories about his renovation plans, his investment philosophy, and his vision for the property's future appreciation. No one interrupted him with suggestions that perhaps he should leave early. No one questioned whether his work matters were being appropriately attended to. No one implied that his presence was potentially embarrassing. My phone delivered a third vibration. Final decision required within 30 minutes. Marina. I composed my response with my screen angled away from curious observers, fingers moving quickly across the glass surface. Proceed with option B. Full authorization granted. Trust your judgment. It was not the outcome I had carefully strategized for the Harrington acquisition, but it was acceptable. Sometimes in business, as in life, you have to accept a good outcome when the perfect one is not available within your constraints. The sacrifice had been completed. Whatever unfolded at this party over the coming hour, whatever Victoria's arrival ultimately brought into this controlled environment, I would face an invisible consequence that no one at this celebration would ever know existed. That was the true price of my strategic silence, not the weakness my family imagined, but a calculated investment in a future return they could not begin to anticipate. I overheard a staff member mention to a colleague that the realtor was running approximately 10 minutes behind schedule. The information drifted past most ears without registering any significance, but it landed on mine like a confirmation that my patience was about to be rewarded. My silence tonight was not the silence of defeat or fear. It was the silence of someone who understood precisely what she was trading and what she would receive in return. The laughter that erupted from the cluster of guests surrounding my father was louder and more sustained than anything that had come before. The sound had the unmistakable quality of performance, too hearty, too prolonged, and too precisely calibrated to draw attention across the entire gathering. I watched as guests from distant corners of the manicured lawn turned toward the noise, curious about what amusing thing they might be missing. My father stood at the absolute center of the group, commanding attention with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime believing his voice was the most important one in any room he entered. I moved closer without appearing to do so, drifting toward the cluster while maintaining the social invisibility I had perfected over decades of family events. The movement went unnoticed. Years of being overlooked had transformed into a kind of unexpected superpower. "You know," my father was saying, his voice projecting, with the warm authority of a man sharing hard-won wisdom, "there are fundamentally two types of children in this world. Some understand instinctively that success requires sacrifice, that you have to fight aggressively for your place in the competitive world. They see opportunities and seize them with both hands." He paused with theatrical timing, allowing the statement to settle over his listeners and permitting them to fill in the obvious conclusion about which of his children he was describing. And then, he continued, his voice softening with regret, "There are those who are content with less, who prefer the path of least resistance, and who never quite develop the hunger that drives real achievement." His eyes found me in the crowd for just a moment, barely a second of direct contact, but long enough for several attentive guests to follow his gaze and understand exactly who served as the cautionary example in his little parable. Several people in the cluster laughed in response, not the laughter of genuine amusement at something witty, but the uncomfortable, complicated laughter of those who recognize they are being invited to participate in someone else's public diminishment. Others nodded with serious expressions, accepting without question the interpretive framework my father had constructed, and mentally filing me into the category of the unsuccessful child, without pausing to wonder whether his categories reflected reality. My mother materialized beside him with the timing of a professional performer hitting her cue. "Eleanor has always been content with whatever she has," she observed. Her tone somehow suggested this was meant as praise while clearly communicating its opposite. "She's never been driven by ambition the way Richard naturally is. Some people simply don't require much to feel satisfied with their lives." The words were carefully wrapped in the language of acceptance and understanding, but their true meaning was transparent to anyone paying attention. I had comprehensively failed to meet the family's standards for success, and they had graciously, generously decided to forgive me for this fundamental inadequacy. My brother appeared on cue, the golden child summoned to complete the family tableau. He offered a modest smile, calculated to suggest he was slightly embarrassed by all this praise, while simultaneously accepting it as his natural due. "I just worked hard and stayed focused," he said with rehearsed humility. "Anyone could accomplish what I've accomplished if they truly committed themselves to excellence." The implication floated in the evening air like perfume I had not genuinely committed, had not worked with sufficient dedication, and had somehow chosen my position at the bottom of the family hierarchy through my own failures of character and discipline. A guest in the cluster turned to address me directly. "Do you think that's a fair assessment?" she asked. For a brief moment, I wondered if she might be challenging the prevailing narrative, but her expression held only polite curiosity, the interest of a spectator who wanted to witness how I would respond to my own systematic public diminishment. The entire group waited in anticipatory silence. My father's smile remained fixed in place, but I detected the slight tension around his eyes, the silent paternal command to play my assigned part, to accept the designated role with appropriate grace, and to avoid making a scene that might complicate his triumphant evening. My mother's hand found his arm in a gesture of marital solidarity, steadying him and preparing to intervene smoothly if I proved difficult. I considered my available options with the analytical clarity I had developed over years of high-stakes business negotiations. I could agree with their assessment, confirming everything they had said about me and my limited nature. I could argue passionately against their characterization, providing ammunition for decades of future commentary about how Eleanor always had to make everything difficult, and how she could never just accept reality gracefully. Or I could do something they were fundamentally unprepared to encounter. "People generally believe what they need to believe," I said. My voice was calm and perfectly level, carrying no trace of emotion that could be interpreted as defensiveness or wounded anger. The words hung suspended in the air between us, ambiguous enough to mean nothing specific while simultaneously meaning everything. The woman who had posed the question blinked several times clearly, uncertain how to respond to a reply that refused to fit expected categories. The conversation faltered noticeably, the smooth machinery of my family's preferred narrative grinding against something it could not efficiently process or incorporate. My father recovered his composure quickly, steering the group's collective attention back toward safer conversational territory. The villa's architectural details, Richard's plans for property improvements, and the tangible success that could be pointed to and admired. The assembled guests followed his conversational lead with visible relief, grateful to return to ground where the social rules were clear and predictable. I stepped back from the cluster, resuming my established position at the party's social periphery. The moment had passed, absorbed into the evening's continuous flow of champagne and mutual congratulation. But I had observed something critically important. My family's confidence had expanded dangerously. They believed they had definitively won this round. They believed they had successfully defined me before this audience controlled the narrative completely and managed the evening's social dynamics with their customary expertise. Their satisfaction radiated from them like heat from sun-baked stones. This expanding confidence was precisely what I needed from them. Overconfidence consistently made people careless and blind. It caused them to assume the future would reliably resemble the past, and that their comfortable version of reality was the only possible version. A staff member approached my father with a quiet message. I could not hear the specific words, but I observed him nod dismissively, barely acknowledging the interruption, before returning his full attention to his admiring audience. Whatever information had been conveyed clearly did not seem significant enough to warrant his sustained interest. But I had been carefully watching the event staff throughout the evening. I observed this same young woman confirming timing, verifying arrangements, and coordinating something clearly operating outside the normal flow of the retirement celebration. They had officially decided who I was in front of everyone whose opinion mattered to them. They had delivered their definitive verdict with the confidence of people who believed their judgment was permanent and final. They remained completely unaware that the truth was preparing to walk through the door. The shift began with a car. Not a flashy arrival designed to command attention or a dramatic entrance calculated to impress, but just a sleek black sedan pulling into the villa's circular drive with the quiet confidence of someone who had no need to announce themselves. The engine fell silent. For a suspended moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened with a soft click, and a woman emerged into the landscape lighting. She appeared to be in her late 40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that communicated wealth and authority without making any obvious effort to do so. Her posture was flawless, and her movements were economical and precise, every gesture suggesting someone accustomed to operating in rooms where the numbers discussed had many zeros. She surveyed the party with quick, professionally assessing eyes, taking in the landscape architecture, the catering setup, and the villa's clean-lined Mediterranean exterior, softly illuminated against the night. Her expression revealed absolutely nothing about her conclusions. Several guests noticed her arrival and paused their conversations to observe. There was something magnetic about her presence, a gravitational force that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with the particular kind of authority that comes from genuine competence. She moved toward the main gathering, not like someone seeking permission to enter, but like someone conducting an evaluation. A staff member approached her immediately. They exchanged brief words too quiet for anyone else to hear. The woman, Victoria the Realtor I had been expecting, nodded once with crisp efficiency and began making her way through the crowd. She did not appear to be searching for anyone in particular. She simply observed her mere presence sufficient to alter the energy of the space around her. My father detected the disturbance in his domain within seconds. I watched his expression shift through several phases: initial curiosity, rapid assessment, and then the instinctive recognition of someone who might represent power or opportunity. He excused himself from his current conversational cluster and moved to intercept her, his considerable social charm already warming up for deployment. "Welcome to our celebration," he said, extending his hand with the confident grip of a man who expected to be acknowledged as the most significant person in any gathering he hosted. "I'm Harold Ashford. This is my retirement party. My son owns this beautiful villa." The introduction was carefully designed to establish hierarchy immediately, to make clear that he was the patriarch, the host, and the center around which this entire evening revolved. Victoria accepted his handshake with professional courtesy, but nothing in her demeanor suggested she was particularly impressed or interested in impressing him in return. "Congratulations on your retirement," she said. Her tone was pleasant but notably lacking warmth. "Lovely property." Her eyes slid past him almost immediately, continuing to scan the assembled guests with that same professionally assessing gaze. I observed my father recalibrating his approach in real time. He was not accustomed to being moved past so efficiently, not familiar with conversations that failed to center on his importance and accomplishments. "Do you work in real estate?" he pressed. His voice carried the slight edge of someone fishing for information that would help him categorize this unexpected variable. "My son Richard just purchased this villa. It was quite the investment, prime location, excellent appreciation potential." Victoria nodded with polite neutrality. "Yes, I noticed the listing when it was available." The response was carefully crafted to reveal nothing about her opinion of the property, the purchase, or the people who had made it. She posed a few brief questions about the evening's occasion's standard social small talk before excusing herself to speak with someone else. My father watched her departure with an expression I had rarely seen on his face, genuine confusion. The interaction had not proceeded according to his expectations. He had presented his credentials, his family's success, and his son's achievement, and she had received all of it with the detached professionalism of someone who routinely dealt with numbers that made his accomplishments look modest. My mother appeared at his side, her finely tuned social antennae clearly detecting that something had deviated from the expected script. "Who was that?" she asked in an undertone, her eyes tracking Victoria's movement through the crowd. "Some realtor," my father replied with attempted dismissiveness. But I detected the note of uncertainty beneath his casual tone. He had encountered something he could not immediately categorize or control, and the experience was visibly unsettling. My brother Richard, apparently briefed on the situation by some invisible family communication network, made his own approach. He intercepted Victoria near the refreshment table and launched into an enthusiastic description of the villa, the square footage, the renovation potential, the neighborhood's property value trajectory, and his own sophisticated investment thesis. He was performing expertise, attempting to establish himself as someone worthy of serious professional consideration. Victoria listened attentively for perhaps 30 seconds before politely extracting herself. She had not been overtly rude, but she had also demonstrated no particular interest in what he was saying. Richard was left standing alone with his performance interrupted mid-sentence, visibly uncertain about what had just occurred. Guests throughout the party were beginning to take notice Victoria's selective engagement and her refusal to be impressed by the evening's designated stars. It was becoming a subject of quiet speculation. Who was she looking for? Why had she come to this particular event? Why did the villa's owners not seem to command her interest? And then her eyes found me across the lawn. The moment of direct contact lasted only seconds, but it felt significantly longer. She looked at me with unmistakable recognition, a slight nod of professional acknowledgement that carried far more weight than anything she had offered my father or brother. Then she continued her circuit through the party, speaking briefly with various guests and gathering information through a process that appeared casual but was clearly systematic. My father had witnessed the exchange. I watched realization and confusion battle across his features as he processed what he had observed. "Do you know her?" he demanded, moving toward me with more aggressive energy than he had displayed all evening. "A realtor appeared at your party," I replied, keeping my voice completely calm and my expression neutral. "I have no idea why that would have anything to do with me." He had no effective response. His certainty was developing cracks, tiny fractures appearing in the foundation of his absolute control over the evening's narrative. He looked toward my mother, toward my brother, and toward Victoria, now engaged in conversation with a cluster of clearly wealthy guests on the far side of the gathering. I caught a fragment of Victoria's words as she passed near a staff member. "I'll wait for the right moment." The sentence was not intended for my ears, but I absorbed it nonetheless. The right moment. Something was approaching, and my family had no understanding of what it might be. The party no longer belonged to them. The atmosphere throughout the party had undergone a transformation difficult to articulate precisely, but impossible to ignore. Conversations grew quieter and more watchful. The easy flow of champagne and superficial small talk had been interrupted by Victoria's commanding presence. Guests were now operating with heightened attention, sensing that something significant was unfolding just beneath the surface of the retirement celebration. I noticed that eyes kept drifting toward Victoria wherever she positioned herself. She had established herself apart from my family's social orbit, engaging primarily with guests my father considered truly important, successful business leaders and significant investors, people whose professional opinions actually mattered in worlds beyond this villa's manicured lawn. More significantly, she was not actively seeking these conversations. They were seeking her. A man I recognized as a prominent local developer approached Victoria with the particular deference of someone requesting an audience with a superior. They spoke for several minutes in voices too quiet for me to hear. I observed the developer's expression undergo a visible transformation from initial curiosity to growing respect to something that approached genuine awe. When their conversation concluded, he surveyed the party with noticeably different eyes, as if seeing every person present in an entirely new light. My father observed this interaction as well. He attempted to reassert himself into the evening's shifting power dynamics, approaching the same developer with his practiced bonhomie firmly in place. "Wonderful party, isn't it?" he offered with manufactured warmth. "Have you had a chance to see Richard's villa from the inside? The craftsmanship is truly exceptional. You'd appreciate it as someone who understands quality construction." The developer nodded politely, but his attention was clearly located elsewhere. "Yes, very nice," he said, with the distracted courtesy of someone whose mind was engaged with more important matters. "If you'll excuse me, I need to follow up on something." He walked away without the deference my father was accustomed to receiving, automatically leaving him standing alone with his enthusiastic compliment floating unanswered in the evening air. My mother cornered one of her established social contacts, a woman who served on multiple prestigious boards and charity committees. "Who exactly is that Realtor?" she asked, keeping her voice appropriately low while her eyes tracked Victoria's movements. "She seems to know absolutely everyone who matters." The response she received was deliberately vague, but deeply revealing. "Victoria specializes in very private transactions," the board member explained with careful discretion. "Very private, very substantial. I've heard she won't even consider clients below a certain threshold." She did not specify what that financial threshold might be, but her tone conveyed clearly that it was far beyond anything the Ashford family typically discussed. My brother, sensing the uncomfortable shift in social attention, made another determined attempt to recapture his position at the evening center. He launched into an expanded explanation of his renovation plans to anyone who would pause to listen, describing in elaborate detail the potential appreciation of his property and his sophisticated long-term investment strategy. A few polite guests stopped to hear him out, but the enthusiasm that had greeted his earlier presentations was notably diminished. Victoria's presence had introduced an entirely new scale of comparison into the proceedings, and my brother's villa suddenly seemed merely adequate rather than impressive. Victoria crossed my path again as she moved through the crowd. This time she stopped. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was pitched low enough that only I could hear the words clearly. The greeting was brief and professionally appropriate, but somehow weighted with significance that nearby observers could sense without understanding. She did not address me by name, did not explain how we might know each other, and did not provide any context for curious onlookers. Then she nodded once and continued on her measured way through the gathering. but the moment had been witnessed. Several guests who had been tracking her movements observed the exchange. I could almost feel the wave of recalculation rippling outward through the crowd. Who was I that this mysterious, powerful realtor would single me out for personal acknowledgement when she had barely spared 2 minutes for the evening's supposed hosts? A woman I had encountered earlier, the one who had been informed I was the low-pressure member of the family, approached me with a markedly different expression than before. "I don't believe we were ever properly introduced," she said, her tone noticeably warmer and her manner more respectful. "I'd love to hear more about what you actually do, if you're willing to share." I provided the same neutral, uninformative response I had been offering all evening, but this time the identical words landed entirely differently. Where before my professional vagueness had been interpreted as evidence of having nothing worth discussing, now it seemed sophisticated, perhaps strategic, the careful discretion of someone who did not require validation from casual acquaintances. My father intercepted me before I could drift away from the conversation, his face tight with poorly concealed anxiety. All pretense of the benevolent patriarch had been stripped away by circumstances he could not control. "Don't say anything foolish," he hissed, his fingers gripping my arm with more force than necessary. "I don't understand what's happening here, but you will not embarrass this family tonight." I looked deliberately at his hand on my arm, then raised my eyes to meet his. The fear was visible now, breaking through his carefully maintained facade of confident authority. He did not understand what Victoria's presence signified, but his instincts were telling him that his control over the evening's narrative was slipping rapidly away. He was scrambling desperately to contain damage he could not yet clearly see. "I haven't said anything at all," I reminded him, keeping my voice perfectly steady and calm. "I've been nothing but well-behaved and appropriate. Exactly what you've always wanted from me." The response seemed to confuse him more than it comforted him. He released my arm and stepped backward, looking around the party, as if searching for something solid that might restore his accustomed sense of authority. Around us, the celebration continued in its modified form. But the fundamental nature of the gathering had changed. Guests were no longer proceeding toward the natural conclusion of an enjoyable evening. Instead, they were lingering, observing, and waiting with undisguised curiosity. Something was clearly about to happen, and no one wanted to miss whatever it turned out to be. I did not need to take any action. The truth was coming, carried by someone else's voice and authority. All I had to do was remain exactly where I was and let it arrive. The first visible crack in my family's meticulously constructed narrative emerged from a completely innocent question. An older gentleman, someone who clearly operated in the world of significant real estate transactions himself, approached Victoria with the comfortable familiarity of professional equals encountering each other at a social function. "Any interesting closings recently?" he inquired. Victoria offered a measured smile. "A few noteworthy ones," she acknowledged. "One particularly significant transaction. Private buyer, all cash, completely off-market. Very discreet client who values privacy above recognition." She did not volunteer specific numbers, but the way she delivered the information suggested figures that would dwarf anything typically discussed at gatherings like this one. The gentleman's eyebrows rose perceptibly. "All cash at significant scale. That's becoming increasingly rare in this market. What category of property are we discussing?" "Premium estate," Victoria replied with professional neutrality. 20 million range, waterfront location. The kind of property that never appears on public listings. She allowed the number to land without emphasis or drama, as if it were simply a factual detail. Several guests who had been engaged in their own discussions stopped speaking to listen. 20 million, all cash, private buyer. These were words that commanded immediate attention in any room, but especially in this particular room at this specific party, where the evening's host had just been celebrating his son's purchase of a villa that had cost a modest fraction of that amount. My father sensed the disturbance in his domain and attempted to reclaim control through direct intervention. "Speaking of noteworthy real estate," he interjected loudly, "my son's villa represents quite the investment opportunity. The neighborhood values in this area have been appreciating remarkably. Victoria nodded with impeccable politeness. Yes, this is a pleasant property, and the subtle emphasis she placed on pleasant was almost imperceptible, but everyone present heard the distinction clearly. She turned back to the gentleman she had been addressing effectively, but graciously dismissing my father, without delivering any overt rudeness. My mother's face had lost much of its carefully maintained color. I observed her processing the implications the scale of transaction. Victoria had casually mentioned the effortless way my father had been sidelined and the growing interest of guests who were now focused on an entirely different kind of success story. My brother stood near the villa's entrance with noticeably diminished confidence. The property that had been the triumphant centerpiece of his evening suddenly seemed reduced in significance. Its impressive Mediterranean facade was transformed into simply another pleasant house rather than the extraordinary achievement it had been presented as throughout the celebration. Victoria continued her conversation with the older gentleman, allowing a few additional carefully selected details to emerge naturally. The buyer maintains a remarkably low profile. No flashy lifestyle, no public displays of wealth, no social media presence. A very intelligent approach to managing significant resources, actually. You would never guess what they're worth simply from observation. She did not look toward me as she offered this description, but several guests in the vicinity did. "Is this private buyer present at this party?" someone asked directly. Victoria's smile remained professionally enigmatic. "She values her privacy," she said simply. The single pronoun hung in the evening air like a signal flare. She, a woman, a private woman who preferred anonymity over recognition, a woman who had recently purchased a property worth more than 10 times what this celebrated villa had cost. Eyes began systematically scanning the assembled guests. The women present were being evaluated, reassessed, and measured against this intriguing new information. My mother was clearly not the mysterious buyer. Her wealth was entirely my father's wealth, thoroughly documented and displayed. The handful of other women who projected significant means were quickly eliminated through various observable tells. And then with growing inevitability, gazes began settling on me, the overlooked daughter, the family member who had spent the entire evening being dismissed and diminished, the woman whose apparent lack of success had been the gathering's running joke. I maintained my silence. I did not confirm the speculation, nor did I deny it. I simply stood exactly where I had been standing all evening, present calm and unmoved, allowing the silence itself to accomplish what words never could. My father's expression had progressed from confused to genuinely alarmed. I could see him attempting to recalculate and struggling to fit this new information into his long-held understanding of his children. The familiar equations were failing to balance. The narrative he had constructed over decades was encountering data it could not absorb. From this moment forward, they stopped asking who I was. They started reconsidering why they had ever presumed to judge me. The question emerged from a man who had clearly built his considerable fortune on directness and clarity. He possessed no patience for social niceties or diplomatic ambiguity. He wanted straightforward information. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said to Victoria, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with authoritative precision. "You are telling us that your VIP cash buyer for a $20 million waterfront property is someone present at this gathering." The crowd around them had expanded significantly, drawn irresistibly by the magnetic pull of imminent revelation. Every conversation in the immediate vicinity had ceased entirely. Victoria's response came measured and thoroughly professional. "I am saying that I work exclusively with clients who value discretion above public recognition. The property I referenced cannot reasonably be compared to something like this." She gestured with casual grace toward my brother's villa. "They exist in entirely different categories of the market." A murmur cascaded through the assembled guests. Different categories. The phrase landed with the impact of a judicial verdict on everything my family had spent the evening celebrating. My father's composure cracked visibly for the first time all evening. He attempted what was clearly intended as a dismissive laugh, but the sound emerged forced and hollow. "Well, that's certainly quite a dramatic claim," he managed. "Anyone can assert they have extremely wealthy clients." Victoria turned to regard him with an expression that was not quite pity, but occupied closely neighboring emotional territory. "Of course," she responded simply. She did not argue with his skepticism or defend her credentials. Her absolute refusal to engage with his challenge somehow made his doubt seem more desperate. Obviously, the grasping of a man watching his authority dissolve. My mother had positioned herself physically close to my brother, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that might have signified maternal comfort or physical restraint. Her face had progressed through multiple visible transformations, initial confusion, growing concern, and now something that resembled genuine fear about what might be coming next. My brother himself appeared nearly paralyzed by the evening's unexpected trajectory. The spotlight he had basked in so comfortably throughout the celebration had turned harsh and unflattering. Guests who had been enthusiastically praising his accomplishments were now visibly recalculating, measuring his success against an entirely new standard. The direct man was not yet satisfied. He surveyed the party with sharp, assessing eyes before settling with deliberate focus on me. "And let me hazard an educated guess," he said slowly. "The VIP client you're describing is someone who has been systematically underestimated throughout this evening's festivities." Victoria's response came without hesitation, but also without explicit confirmation. "My clients' identities remain private as a matter of fundamental practice. I will observe that she demonstrates excellent judgment about when to speak and when to allow others to reveal themselves through their own words." Her eyes met mine for just a moment. I maintained my exact position without variation. I simply existed in the space, present and silent, permitting the silence itself to serve as the most eloquent evidence available. The transformation in how guests perceived me was immediate and striking. They studied me with careful, sustained attention. I observed as several guests began visibly remembering their own behavior toward me. Throughout the evening, the woman who had asked if I was merely visiting the man who had labeled me low pressure, and the cluster who had laughed at my father's comparison. Each of them was now confronting the uncomfortable possibility that they had been wrong. My father made one final effort. "This is completely ridiculous," he declared, but his voice had lost its resonant authority. "Eleanor doesn't possess that kind of wealth. I would certainly know if she did. She's my daughter." "Would you?" someone in the crowd asked quietly. The simple question hung suspended in the air, fundamentally unanswerable, given everything that had just been revealed. I did not need to announce who I was. They finally understood far too late to matter. The silence that descended was unlike anything I had experienced in 3 decades of family gatherings. It was the profound silence of comprehensive recalculation. The party's familiar rhythms had been completely suspended, replaced by something that felt more like a collective reckoning. I observed as the gathering reorganized itself around new gravitational centers. Guests who had been clustered attentively around my father and brother began drifting away. Small conversational groups formed spontaneously near me and Victoria. My father attempted to reestablish his accustomed position through sheer force of social will. He approached a group of guests and launched energetically into a familiar story about his career accomplishments. The response he received was polite, but noticeably distant. People nodded at appropriate intervals, but their eyes kept sliding away, seeking more interesting conversations elsewhere. A woman I did not recognize approached me. "I didn't realize," she said simply. "Most people don't," I replied. Victoria began making her way toward the exit, pausing to exchange brief, professional farewells with various guests along her path. When she reached my position, she stopped for a final professional acknowledgement. She did not speak my name, but her proximity communicated more clearly than any announcement could have. My brother had retreated to a defensive position near the villa's entrance, occupying the same doorway that had been the location of my public humiliation just hours earlier. But the dynamics had reversed with devastating completeness. He was now simply a man guarding a diminished prize. My mother stood increasingly alone. Her decades of practiced social coordination skills were rendered temporarily useless. She kept looking between me, my father, and the departing Victoria, clearly hoping someone would somehow restore the comfortable natural order she had always known. A man who had been identified earlier as a significant local investor approached me directly. "I believe I owe you an apology," he said. "I made assumptions tonight that were clearly unfounded." "People generally see what they're told to see," I replied without any particular emotion. "It's not entirely their fault." My father stood at the far edge of the gathering, observing as the social capital he had accumulated over an entire lifetime was being systematically devalued in real time. The silence that had initially gripped the party began filling gradually with new conversations, but the fundamental tone had transformed irreversibly. I did not win this moment by speaking. I won because no one retained the authority to speak for me anymore. The gathering had divided itself into two distinct territories, separated by an invisible boundary. One region hosted clusters of guests gravitating toward me. The other territory contained my family, my father, mother, and brother, forming an increasingly isolated defensive perimeter. My father was the first to attempt organized damage control. He approached a group of long-standing family friends. "We've always been tremendously proud of Eleanor," he announced, his voice projecting the warm confidence of a man sharing an obvious truth. "She's always been the independent one in the family, built something genuinely impressive, completely on her own." The friends he addressed listened with appropriate politeness, but they had witnessed what he said earlier in the evening. They understood perfectly that this new narrative represented a frantic attempt to rewrite recent history. My mother adopted a different tactical approach. She made her way toward me, her expression softened into something approximating maternal warmth. "Eleanor, sweetheart," she said, reaching for my hand, "we really should talk privately. There's clearly been so much unfortunate misunderstanding between us." I observed her extended hand without accepting it. "Not tonight," I said quietly. I simply established a boundary, something I had never successfully accomplished in 3 decades of being her daughter. She stood frozen for a long moment, visibly uncertain how to proceed with someone who would not follow the expected script. My simple "not tonight" had removed all of her accustomed power with 2 quiet words. My brother attempted his own salvage operation, but his approach was fundamentally handicapped. He could not claim to have always respected me without simultaneously acknowledging that his entire status had been constructed on a framework that required my diminishment. Every attempt to speak kindly about me now functioned as an implicit admission that he had knowingly benefited from my systematic devaluation. Victoria approached me before departing. "It was good to see you this evening," she said. "I'll be in contact next week regarding the final details." The implication was unmistakable. There was substantial, ongoing business between us. Several guests approached me in the time that followed, offering various forms of belated acknowledgement. Some delivered direct apologies. Others executed subtle social realignments. I received each interaction with the same neutral grace I had maintained throughout the entire evening. My father stood alone as the party wound toward its conclusion. He appeared older suddenly, somehow smaller. The commanding presence of the evening's confident host was reduced to simply a man who had been publicly and comprehensively proven wrong. I selected my moment of departure with care at a time of my own deliberate choosing, when my exit would carry its own clear message. I collected my belongings, offered genuine acknowledgement to the few guests who had treated me with actual respect, and walked toward the exit. No one blocked my path this time. No one questioned my right to come and go exactly as I chose. The power my father had weaponized at the villa's entrance had transferred completely. They did not lose me that night, they lost the power to define who I was. The drive home unfolded in silence that felt earned rather than empty. City lights blurred past my windows, ordinary and beautiful. I did not reach for music or podcasts to fill the quiet space. I simply drove, allowing the evening's events to settle gradually into their proper place within my history. When I arrived at my home, not the waterfront estate Victoria had described, which remained largely unoccupied as a long-term investment, but the comfortable townhouse where I actually lived my daily life, I sat in my car for a long moment before going inside. The silence surrounding me was fundamentally different here. It was my silence, chosen and comfortable. I allowed myself to revisit the moment when my father had blocked me at the entrance to my brother's villa. Just hours ago, that confrontation had felt like a wound being deliberately reopened. Now it felt like something else entirely, the last time he would ever possess that particular power over me. I thought about my mother's expression when she began to understand what Victoria's presence signified. The narrative she had constructed and maintained about her successful son and her disappointing daughter had crumbled in the span of a single hour. I thought about my brother standing in the doorway of a villa that had suddenly become merely ordinary. He had simply accepted the advantageous role they assigned him, enjoying the privileges of being the golden child without ever questioning what that designation cost his sister. But I did not feel the triumphant satisfaction I might have anticipated. There was no surge of vindictive pleasure. Instead, there was something quieter and more profound, the simple, profound relief of no longer requiring their validation to know my own worth. For years I had constructed my success in deliberate secrecy. Now that careful protection was no longer necessary. They knew the truth, and more importantly, everyone they had ever tried to impress with their version of reality knew the truth. My phone buzzed softly. A text message from an unfamiliar number glowed in the darkness. "We should talk. Mom." I read the words and discovered nothing within myself that required an immediate response. She was reaching out because her social standing had suffered visible damage. I had spent 30 years responding to those manipulation needs at the cost of my own well-being. That chapter of my life was finished. I set the phone aside and walked into my house. The space embraced me with its comfortable familiarity filled with objects I had selected for my own pleasure. I reflected on Victoria's words, the way she had described her VIP client as someone who valued privacy above public recognition. She had been accurately describing me, articulating a philosophy I had consciously adopted years ago: wealth without performance, achievement without announcement, power without the exhausting need to wield it visibly for others' benefit. The evening's events felt like a correction. For 30 years, my family had insisted on telling a story about me that bore no relationship to truth. Tonight, that false story had been publicly corrected by forces entirely outside their control. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my favorite chair by the window. Tomorrow would bring business requiring attention, but tonight there was only this: the profound, quiet satisfaction of finally being seen for exactly who I had always been, not because I had demanded recognition, but because I had simply outlasted the lies with patience and persistence. And truth, patient, implacable, inevitable, had finally spoken clearly for itself. That night, I left the party without carrying anything away with me, because at last, after all those years, I was no longer missing anything at all.